My name is Ramiro. I'm a member of Anticonquista. Anticonquista is the Communist Party of the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And welcome to episode 6 of Decolonizing Media. Decolonizing Media is a video podcast dedicated to exposing imperialist and capitalist lies in the mainstream media, especially as it relates to Latin America and the Third World. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that everyone is talking about right now, and I'm sure you've seen some of the content on Anticonquista's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. about Venezuela. We're going to talk about the US-backed coup, the slow-motion coup that's happening in Venezuela right now, supported by the Donald Trump administration, John Bolton, and also carried out by the wealthy, right-wing, white Venezuelan opposition that is taking its orders directly from Washington, directly from the European countries. And so today we're going to take a listen and watch a video by none other than Joanna Hausmann. If you recall, we did a rebuttal video about Joanna Hausmann called White Settler Lies About Venezuela. It's actually the first episode of Decolonizing Media. I suggest you check that out for some more background. And I decided to pick Joanna Hausmann's latest video because it exemplifies the perspective that the mainstream media is putting out there. The same story you've been hearing over and over and over again, that Maduro's a dictator, that the country's falling apart, that the US needs to go in and install democracy and help the people, which we all know is complete bullshit. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. What's happening in Venezuela, Just the Facts by Joanna Hausmann, published January 28th, 2019.
Venezuela. A lot of people are talking about the complicated situation in my home country, and there is a lot of misinformation. So I did a bunch of research to explain in the clearest way possible what is going on in a way that I hope people can understand, because goddamn doesn't matter right now. Will this be funny? No, I am very much not in a funny mood. So let's begin with some important bullet points. 1. What is happening in Venezuela is not a US-backed coup.
First of all, her music is corny as fuck. But that's besides the point. Anyway, she says this is not a US-backed coup. According to a September 2018 report by the New York Times, the Trump administration held secret meetings with rebellious renegade military officers from the Venezuelan armed forces over the last year to discuss plans to forcibly overthrow Maduro. And according to a 2018 investigation in August by Venezuelan Attorney General Tarek Saab into the assassination attempt against Maduro in August, those responsible for the attack, the financiers and the planners, live in the US, specifically in Florida. Lastly, according to a 2002 investigation by The Observer, the attempted coup against former President Hugo Chavez, the president before Nicolás Maduro, the leader of the Bolivarian Revolution, was, quote, closely tied to senior officials in the U.S. government under the administration of former President George W. Bush. Now, linked to the coup plot in 2002 was Elliot Abrams, who is now special envoy to Venezuela. So don't come and tell me that this isn't a US-backed coup when you have the New York Times, the pinnacle of bourgeois mainstream media, admitting that the Trump government met with military officers to plan a coup, when the Attorney General of Venezuela is saying that those responsible for the assassination attempt are based in Florida, and when you have Elliot Abrams, who was directly involved in orchestrating the 2002 coup attempt against Hugo Chavez, is now the special envoy to Venezuela. I mean, that's just complete nonsense to think that this is not a US-backed coup. This is 100% a US-backed coup.
2, this is not a fight between the Venezuelan right wing and the Venezuelan left wing. This is a fight of the great majority of Venezuelans to democratically get rid of an illegitimate and punitive dictatorship. A dictatorship responsible for countless human rights abuses.
She says this is not about political ideology. This is 100% about political ideology. This is about capitalism versus socialism. This is about the past versus the future. The oil reporting agency S&P Global Platts reported that in the immediate wake of the U.S. anointing Guaido as Venezuela's so-called president, he already drafted plans to introduce new hydrocarbons laws that establishes flexible fiscal and contractual terms for projects, meaning that privatization is an option for Venezuela's oil. Now, under capitalism, under a capitalist economic and political system, privatization is encouraged, the free market, right? You have these private companies that profit off of natural resources like oil. Under socialism, under a socialist economy, the profits from natural resources like oil are used for social programs the way they have been for the past over 18 years in Venezuela since 1999. So this is 100% about political ideology. Guaido wants to reverse Venezuela back to capitalism, where the poor exploited working class masses weren't earning any of the profits from oil, and Maduro wants to keep using the profits from oil for the people. This is 100% political.
3, the people of Venezuela are seeking fair democratic elections using the laws written in our constitution.
So she says the people of Venezuela want democracy, as if there isn't already democracy in Venezuela. Venezuela has a multi-party system, with all parties allowed to participate in elections. All of the major opposition parties, including Primero Justicia, Acción Democrática, COPEI, and others, have never been banned. They're allowed to participate. Since the start of the Bolivarian Revolution in 1999, there have been 6 presidential elections, 4 parliamentary elections, and dozens of nationwide consultations, according to the National Electoral Council. Under the Venezuelan constitution, the president is directly elected through a popular vote to a 6-year term. This is direct democracy, the popular vote. And it's not like representative republicanism in the United States where you have an electoral college that actually makes the final call. You have direct democracy in Venezuela. During the last presidential election in May 2018, Maduro won with 67.8% of votes compared to opposition candidates Henry Falcón with 20.9% and Javier Bertucci with 10.8%. Despite sectors of the opposition boycotting the election, the turnout rate was 46.07%. And during the last presidential election in May 2018, more than 150 members of the International Electoral Accompaniment Mission released a statement saying, quote, "We, the international accompaniers, consider that the technical and professional trustworthiness and independence of the National Electoral Council of Venezuela are uncontestable." This is directly from international observers from all over the world who can attest to the legitimacy of Venezuela's electoral process.
4, Juan Guaido did not just declare himself president out of nowhere. That is not how it worked. So let's answer some questions. Who is the interim president, Juan Guaido? Juan Guaido is not a right-wing politician, but the son of a taxi driver and a liberal representative in Congress. Guaido was elected by the Venezuelan people to be a representative in Venezuela's National Assembly. He is acting as interim president, as in temporary president, until democratic elections can be ensured, which is, by the way, dictated by law in the Constitution when a president is deemed illegitimate. In other words, this is not a coup. Next question.
According to the Wall Street Journal, the night before Guaido declared himself interim president of Venezuela, that was January 23rd, he received a phone call from U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, pledging to back his illegal power grab. And Pence reportedly told Guaido that if the National Assembly invoked Article 233 of Venezuela's constitution, which is used to usurp interim power, the Trump regime would back him. And that's according to the Wall Street Journal. These are all facts that are publicly available. You can find this online, but they are not presented in a uniform, combined way. They're purposely presented in isolated ways that prevent you from seeing that this is a US-backed coup. This is an invasion. And Hausmann refuses to understand that.
Why is President Nicolás Maduro illegitimate? Now this may take a little bit longer because there's a lot, but let's speed this thing up and start in 2017. In 2017, the Supreme Court that was handpicked by Nicolás Maduro's party nullified and stripped the National Assembly or Congress of their powers. The National Assembly was chosen by vote and was the only government institution that was run by an opposition majority. Imagine when the Democrats took the House, if Trump was like, no, I don't like this anymore. The House is no longer a legitimate part of government, and here's another House that I made up with everyone that agrees with me. Americans would be furious. So too are Venezuelans. Venezuela erupted in protests. Hundreds of protesters, most of them teenagers, were detained, some of whom were tortured and murdered. Meanwhile, despite these protests, Maduro made his own Congress that he could control, just like that. Fast forward to May 20th, 2018, where this illegitimate Congress calls for presidential elections. Now, during these elections, the most popular opposition candidates are either jailed, exiled, or banned from running. In other words, there is no legitimate way for the opposition to run. So these sham presidential elections are held anyway by Maduro's government, where only 20% of the population voted. However, a lot of the 20% were public employees who were intimidated into voting by threats from the government. These were called illegitimate elections, not just by the Venezuelan people, but by the international community. Everyone was on board saying, yeah, this shit's fucked up, and if it's anything, it's definitely undemocratic.
So she makes a few claims here that I want to address. Number one, she says that in 2017, the Supreme Court that was handpicked by Maduro's party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, nullified and stripped the National Assembly of their powers. Now, she makes it seem like one day he just woke up and was like, I don't like this National Assembly. I want them to leave. And just decided to go do away with them. And that's the narrative that she's feeding into, that this is all random, that this is some random act of paranoia. Let me remind you that the National Assembly is controlled by the opposition. The opposition has basically been trying to block any sort of progressive legislation that the ruling Progressive Socialist Party has wanted to put in place. The National Assembly, controlled by the opposition, has acted against the government. Now, according to Venezuela's constitution, 32 justices, magistrados of the Tribunal Suprema de Justicia, the Supreme Court, are appointed by the National Assembly and serve non-renewable 12-year terms. So they were not handpicked by Maduro's party. They were picked by the National Assembly, which, as I said, is currently dominated by the opposition. On January 5th, 2016, the Supreme Court of Venezuela declared the National Assembly in contempt for swearing in 3 opposition lawmakers whose elections were suspended temporarily for voting irregularities in the Amazon region. Now, according to the New York Times, the 3 opposition lawmakers were accused of buying votes for the opposition in Amazonas, which is a state in Venezuela. It's a very desolate state. And given that it had been operating with the non-verified people acting as legislators, the court said that all of the assembly's actions are legal, which I think is a legitimate thing. If you're just randomly bringing in people who are buying votes and not following procedure, then obviously your powers should be limited and curbed. Article 336.9 of the country's constitution allows and gives power to the constitutional chamber of the Supreme Court to resolve any situation that may arise among state powers, which is exactly what happened. This is all in accordance with the Constitution of Venezuela. She also says that opposition protesters were tortured and murdered. Now, according to Venezuela Analysis, which is an independent journalist group on the ground in Venezuela, they have some really great work. I suggest you check out their website, venanalysis.com. 126 people were killed during the 2017 protest against Maduro's government. I'm sure you all remember that. Of those 126 deaths, only 14 were killed by government forces. Meanwhile, 23 were killed by opposition protesters. 14 deaths were linked to looting, 3 deaths were linked to pro-government civilians, 3 were accidental deaths, and 61 deaths are still unaccounted for and under investigation. So it's extremely deceptive to try to place the blame on all of these deaths on the Maduro government and the Chavistas, because clearly a lot of them still haven't been investigated. Clearly, the reasons for a lot of people dying were because of the opposition protests to begin with, the street barricades, the guarimbas, etc. And you even have the case of Orlando Figueroa, a young black Chavista who was burned alive just for being Chavista by the opposition. But again, those are the deaths that we're never going to hear from right-wing mainstream commentators like Joanna Hausmann. And also keep in mind that the organizations claiming that the government tortured protesters include human rights NGOs like Foro Penal, which gets backing from the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, and Amnesty International, which gets funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, the UK Department for International Development, the European Commission, the US State Department, and other governments, according to their 2009 INGO Accountability Report. So you have this group, Foro Penal, that's saying, all these opposition people are being killed, human rights abuses, and they're all getting money directly from the US and UK governments. They're all getting money from the Rockefellers. Are we really going to take them seriously when they talk about human rights abuses and claiming to be unbiased? And lastly, she says Maduro made his own Congress that he can control. The Congress she's talking about is the Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, which was voted on and elected by over 8 million Venezuelans in the country. There was a 41% turnout rate for the Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, according to the National Electoral Council President Tivise Lucena. It's composed of 545 members that includes separate congresses and caucuses for black people, indigenous people, women, LGBTQ people, etc. And this diverse group of people representing all sectors of civil society was tasked with updating the country's constitution in a democratic manner. That's direct democracy. That's democracy in action. And addressing two more claims that she makes in this part of the video, she says only 20% of people voted in the presidential election of 2018. Wrong. As I mentioned before, the turnout rate was 46.07%, and that's according to official figures. She also says 20% of public employees who voted were intimidated. I honestly think she totally pulled that out of her ass, because I haven't seen that anywhere. Where is there proof that the Venezuelan government intimidated government workers to vote for the United Socialist Party of Venezuela? I've never seen that. And if someone has a source for that, send it to me and I'll be glad to take a look. But I've never heard of that before.
Now, if you're wondering how the Venezuelan people truly feel about this, here are some statistics. According to recent polls, over 80% of Venezuelans disapprove of Maduro's government because there is a lot to disapprove of.
She says over 80% of Venezuelans disapprove of Maduro's government. The source she cites, the Latin American Herald Tribune, a right-wing online publication, gets their statistic from an organization called Data Analysis. One of the directors of Data Analysis is Jose Antonio Gil Yepes, who worked for the private Spanish bank Banco Santander, which also invests money in private oil companies, interestingly enough. Data Analysis also gets money from guess who? The National Endowment for Democracy and the Ford Foundation. A key analyst at Data Analysis, Luis Leon, was listed as an advisor to the US-based Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, in a recent grant application to the US National Endowment for Democracy, according to public records. The CIPE, along with Venezuela-based Center for the Dissemination of Economic Information, CEDICE, were key contributors to the Venezuelan opposition umbrella group Coordinadora Democrática. So what we see here is all these polling companies and NGOs, they're all in cahoots with each other. They're all getting money from the same places. They're all getting money from Washington. They're all getting money from huge NGOs based in London. They're all getting money from the same places, the same fountain of information. So we really have to question the validity of these figures that she's citing.
Maduro took the minimum wage from $350 a month to $7 a month.
Maduro took the minimum wage from $350 a month to $7 a month. Again, false. On January 15th, 2019, Maduro announced a 300% increase to the nation's minimum monthly salary from 4,500 bolivars to 18,000 bolivars. In 2018, the minimum wage was raised 5 times, according to Al Jazeera. And since Maduro has taken office, the minimum wage has only gone up, not down. Where is she getting these numbers from?
Meanwhile, inflation hit 1.7 million % in 2018, with the IMF projecting 10 million % in 2019. So the daily minimum wage can't buy 2 eggs.
Yes, there is inflation in Venezuela. And that's something that the government admits. It's not a secret. The government says one of the biggest issues we have is inflation. But it's not a product of socialist economic planning. It's a product of cash hoarding and capitalist economic sabotage. Now, in August 2018, Attorney General Saab, who I mentioned before, said his office received numerous complaints of reporting price speculation, hoarding, and economic destabilization following the implementation of the economic recovery plan implemented by Maduro's government. This was a plan introduced by Maduro to help boost the economy in the face of sanctions, sabotage, etc. Now, among the prisoners were several managers of large commercial chains who speculated and hoarded basic basket products, which causes damage to the population. We're talking about grain, we're talking about vegetables, food. People are hoarding food, people are hoarding money so that the economy suffers, so that the Venezuelan people suffer, and then they can blame it on the Venezuelan government. In February 2017, a massive hoard of 50 and 100 Venezuelan Bolivar bills amounting to 30 tons in weight, 30 tons of money, was uncovered in a house in Paraguay on the Brazilian border, according to the Associated Press. Similar cash hoarding schemes have been uncovered in neighboring Colombia. So inflation is a product of economic sabotage by the opposition, not socialist economic planning.
According to UN projections, over 5 million people have left the country, causing a refugee crisis of Syrian proportions. That's more than 10% of the Venezuelan population.
She says over 5 million people have left the country. Yeah, that's true. I'm not going to deny that fact. That is true. However, as I mentioned before, migration is the product of capitalist economic sabotage. These sanctions imposed by the U.S. and hoarding and all other acts of sabotage carried out by the opposition forces people to leave the country. Now, no attention is given to Colombia, which has the highest number of internally displaced people in the world, according to a 2018 report by the United Nations. They estimate that 7.7 million people were forcibly displaced in Colombia. Now, why doesn't that get any attention? Because Colombia is an ally of the United States. It functions under a capitalist economy, and so it's never given the same attention that Venezuela is given when it has problems. Keep that in mind.
There is such a shortage of medical supplies that people are dying from previously eradicated diseases like polio because there aren't any vaccines.
People are dying from previously eradicated diseases. There's medical shortages in Venezuela because U.S. sanctions have prevented Venezuelan people from purchasing medical equipment, which is mainly produced in the U.S. and Europe. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget that Venezuela, Latin America, the third world in general is dependent on the first world companies for medical equipment because overwhelmingly they're built in the United States and Europe. So with these sanctions, and because Venezuela has gone against Wall Street, they can use medical equipment as forms of abuse of the Venezuelan people to try to get them to do what Washington wants. Under Maduro's administration, Venezuela expanded its free healthcare coverage to more than 60% of the population. In March 2017, Maduro's government announced a decree that increased salaries for all doctors working in the public health sector by 50%, according to the Ministry of People's Power for Health. In 2017, the United Nations Program for Development placed Venezuela among the countries with the highest Human Development Index, surpassing most Latin American countries. And since 2013, Venezuela has also decreased infant mortality rates, heart disease, HIV/AIDS, etc., according to the World Health Organization. Yes, there are medical issues in Venezuela. Yes, it's not perfect. But under Chavez and under Maduro, a lot has been done for the health of the Venezuelan people. And any medical issues and diseases that are coming about now are the result of sanctions and economic pressure on Venezuela that prevents them from getting the medical equipment that they need.
The economy is a disaster in a country that sits on the world's largest oil reserves. So where's all this money going? People in Maduro's government. Venezuela is the top 10 most corrupt country in the world, according to the Corruption's Perception Index.
She says all of the money is going to people in Maduro's government. Who are they? Can you even name one? And the Corruption Perception Index is published by Transparency International, an NGO based in Germany. Now check this. In January 2015, it was revealed that Transparency International accepted $3 million from the German engineering company Siemens. It's a multinational company, which in 2008 paid one of the largest corporate corruption fines in history, $1.6 billion, for bribing government officials in numerous countries. So you have the company that is financing Transparency International being accused, paying the biggest corporate corruption fine ever in history. How ironic is that? And Siemens, the company that I was just talking about, which was founded in 1847, was at one point directly run by the Nazis. They owned the trains used to bring people into concentration camps, as well as owned a plant in Auschwitz, according to historian Hannah Arendt. Lastly, the company also supplied electrical parts to Nazi concentration camps and death camps. So I don't think Transparency International and Siemens, their owner, have any right to talk about corruption in Latin America and Venezuela.
The media in Venezuela who should be reporting on this shit is censored and dissidents are jailed. Over 5,000 people since 2014 have been detained for speaking out against the government. And just since last week, when Guaidó was elected, 791 people have been jailed.
So she goes on to talk about so-called media censorship in Venezuela. The main private television networks in Venezuela that are opposed to the government are Televen, Venevisión, and Globovisión. They're not being persecuted by the government. They're allowed to cover whatever they want. And 70% of Venezuela's radio and TV stations are privately owned, according to the communication ministry. And just under 5% are state-owned. So I don't know what she's talking about when she says that private media and opposition media are being suppressed, when clearly there is free reign of thought in the country and opposition members and supporters are allowed to say whatever they want.
What is happening now? Interim President Juan Guaidó has been backed by the international community. Yes, this includes the United States, but do you know who else backs Juan Guaidó that isn't Trump? Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Germany, the Socialist Party that runs Albania, Canada's progressive prince Justin Trudeau, Australia, Paraguay, Peru, the government run by the Socialist Party of Spain, whose president said what is going on in Venezuela is the opposite of socialism. The list goes on.
So she lists all of the countries that support Guaidó and recognize him as the so-called president of Venezuela. Some of them include Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Paraguay, and she didn't mention Honduras, but Honduras as well recognizes Guaidó. In Argentina, under Macri, you have a neoliberal government slashing public benefits, repressing indigenous activists and protesters. In Brazil, you have far-right Bolsonaro, who's basically a fascist, who's repressing Black and Indigenous people, cutting down the Amazon, wants to openly kill LGBTQ people. Colombia, you have Iván Duque, a right-wing U.S. puppet who is carrying out the mass execution of social activists every single day, carried out by the paramilitaries. You have Paraguay, which is basically run by a right-wing government after the 2012 parliamentary coup against Fernando Lugo, where also indigenous people are being repressed. And Honduras, which recognizes Guaidó, which is doing the same thing against Afro-Indigenous people, Garifuna people, etc. So these countries that recognize Guaidó, the so-called international community, can't really speak about human rights and democracy when they have a shit ton of problems in their home country to begin with. And they're directly repressing people in their own countries. But yet again, those countries don't get as much coverage because they fall in line with the US and mainstream media narrative of capitalism.
So that was a lot of information. And I am exhausted. And I'm not exhausted because I had to explain this to you, but I'm exhausted because the situation in Venezuela has been talked about in the forms of political ideologies and politicians and political leanings. And it's the conversation has completely strayed away from what actually matters, which is the Venezuelan people. On a personal level, my immediate family, my father is exiled from back home. My extended family, they go out on these protests. My uncle is in jail for being a journalist that tried to shed light on what was going on. My cousin had to leave Venezuela because they were after him as well.
Just a note, Joanna Hausmann's father, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, is Ricardo Hausmann. He's not some random poor peasant who is being repressed by this huge government. No, he's a wealthy right-wing, banker. He was the former chief economist of the Inter-American Bank, former minister of planning in Venezuela, and current director of the Center for International Development.
This has affected everybody on a human level. And it doesn't matter what leanings you have in an ideological political standpoint. This is about people. This is about people wanting their country back. That's it. And if you have any more questions, ask a Venezuelan, and they can tell you from their personal human level how it's affected them. Please listen.
That's such a liberal argument that you have to trust exactly 100% what the person of that nationality says is true. For example, if you were to go to apartheid South Africa and you were to ask a white South African what they think of apartheid versus a black South African, you'd get two totally different responses. Now, if we apply that same logic to Latin America and the Caribbean, you'll see why that makes sense. If you ask white Venezuelans, wealthy Venezuelans who live in the United States, what they think about Venezuela, obviously they're going to say it's horrible, Maduro's a dictator, because they lost money from the revolution that was redistributed back to the people, the poor people. If you ask poor people in Venezuela what they think about Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution, yeah, sure, they may have some criticisms, but overall, they have a positive view because it's tremendously benefited them in their personal life. So we have to keep in mind the racial and class dynamic when talking about, let's ask a Venezuelan. Because obviously a wealthy white settler Venezuelan like Joanna Hausmann and her family, they're going to give you a totally different response from black and indigenous Venezuelans who have directly benefited from the movement towards socialism in Venezuela. So to conclude, I want to emphasize that what's going on in Venezuela has all to do with imperialism. This is a US-backed coup. The United States, Europe, and the imperialist world order is trying to get rid of Maduro, is trying to get rid of the Socialist Party of Venezuela because they directly threaten their profits, their oil profits. Again, Venezuela has the largest oil reserve in the world. And they also want to scare Latin American and Caribbean countries away from trading with Russia and China. Let's not forget that countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia are trading extensively with Russia and China in a fair and balanced way. That's not an imperial relationship, but rather a win-win cooperation. And the United States is scared of that. Let's not allow Venezuela to become another Iraq, to become another Afghanistan, to become another Libya and even Syria. It's the same game being played over and over and over again. The US has to come in and help some pro-democracy so-called freedom fighters to get rid of a dictator and establish democracy in the free market. Well, how did that turn out for Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan? All of those countries are still in ruins today. Let's not let that happen to Venezuela. Don't believe the mainstream bullshit about Maduro and about the Bolivarian Revolution. So that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Again, this was episode 6 of Decolonizing Media and Anticonquista. Make sure to follow Anticonquista on Facebook, Twitter, IG at Anticonquista. Subscribe to us on YouTube, youtube.com/Anticonquista. You can listen to an audio version of this podcast on SoundCloud, soundcloud.com/Anticonquista. Thanks for supporting us. Thanks for watching and listening to us. And hope to talk to you soon.